Africa needs about 1.5 billion doses to vaccinate 60% of its population, the minimum requirement for herd immunity. But the current supply is limited because richer countries have bought up the majority of doses. Let's discuss this with Health Justice Initiative head Fatima Hassan. Fatima, very good to have you with us this morning. Tell us more about this call.
So thank you for having me on the show. So I think it's quite an important policy shift, and particularly coming from the African Union, which is a regional bloc. The 34th summit of the AU basically took in a recommendation that has been made by many organizations around the world, including the ICJ, including MSF, including many groups in South Africa, as well as in other parts of the global south, for the WTO to recognize that we are in the middle of a devastating crisis in the world. We're in the middle of a pandemic, and this is not the time necessarily to be enforcing intellectual property rules and patents that prevent the ability of others to manufacture quickly and speedily to supply the whole world with much needed supplies of vaccines. And it's not, we're not talking necessarily about generic versions of the vaccines. What we're talking about is the explicit cooperation of many of these companies who have the front-runner vaccine candidates to share that technology and to share the tech transfer so that versions of the vaccines can be made in many parts of the world.
And do you think they'll heed your call, I mean, will they listen? Will they share?
So I think the aspects relating to the waiver was that it was brought in October of last year, but it was jointly submitted by India and South Africa. And like you said earlier, it has the support of over 100 countries. There are a few countries that are blocking that waiver and are actually being an obstacle. And the pharmaceutical industry in particular are not very supportive of that temporary waiver of the obligations of member states in relation to TRIPS just for the duration of the COVID-19 pandemic until population global immunity is achieved, or what people call herd immunity. So had there actually been support for the waiver already from October, I think we would have been in a different situation in the world right now. But in addition to seeking the TRIPS waiver, which would actually make it much easier for everybody around the world to be able to do what is necessary and to take the now very urgent steps to address the global scarcity, which in many cases is artificial and is self-created.
And sorry, let me just jump in here. I mean, is it up to Big Pharma to step in and help? I mean, a lot of the problem here lies in governments just not getting their act together.
So I think it's a combination of companies that are refusing to grant multiple voluntary licenses, who are blocking the waiver, and governments who are not doing enough, not just in terms of securing supplies, but governments also have the ability to take state action and to use compulsory licensing measures. And the waiver was a mechanism to avoid each country in the global south having to institute compulsory licensing measure processes, because it does require the tech transfer and it does require the cooperation of these companies who in many cases developed these vaccines and were co-funded by multiple governments who co-developed and co-funded that particular research. So I think it's a bit more complex than where the individual governments just didn't get their act together. That may be true for part of the reason why we're facing this particular crisis. But in the absence of vaccine manufacturers allowing as many people to manufacture as many vaccines as we actually need, and particularly for South Africa, vaccines that are considered safe and effective, vaccines that actually work with the variants that have been discovered here. It really is a combination of both the private sector and government actually having to have worked in partnership much earlier. From last year already, the warning bells had been ringing by groups such as Oxfam and MSF, who had indicated that there had been so many supplies that had been pre-committed that it would be impossible to achieve with those kind of levels global immunity in the global south for at least another 2 to 3 years.
All right, let's hope they're listening. Fatima Hassan, thank you.